We are live now, Chair.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Good day, committee members, and to those who are viewing. This is the Economic Development Advisory Group meeting on September 21. And today we're meeting for the first time in a couple.
Jim, we can't hear you all of a sudden.
You can't hear me now, or can you?
Yeah,
Now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening and welcome. It's the Economic Development Advisory Group meeting on September 21. And we have an agenda in front of us that moves our work plan forward. We haven't met for a couple of months. We didn't meet in August, and we're picking up on our activities again today. We've had regrets from Michael Warner, who's not able to join us tonight. And also, we're still waiting for the Mayor McQueen to join us. Hopefully that will happen shortly. But out of respect for those who've joined online and those that are here right now, we'll get going with our meeting. We have an agenda in front of us that has the normal opening activities of declaration of pecuniary interest, approval of minutes. There's a couple of items for discussion. I'll be making some comments on the overall work plan. We'll have a presentation on broad demographic overview from Steve Furness. I will be making some comments on where we go next in terms of producing a document called, and that's under the heading 5.3, the Economic Development Outline. And then we will be talking about when we schedule our workshop with council. And hopefully the mayor will be joining us because I'll be requesting that he call a special meeting for that purpose. And then we'll see if there's any additional comments from the director and if there's any comments from any members of the committee. And then we'll talk a little bit about our next meeting. And of course, there'll be a motion to adjourn. Is there any items to add or modify on the agenda as presented? Okay, could I have a motion to approve that agenda, please? Thank you, Kathy, seconded by Tracy. And any further discussion? All in favor? Thank you. And then we have a declaration of pecuniary interest based on that agenda. Does anyone have a declaration of interest or conflict? If you don't see it now, if the conversation heads off towards a conflict item for you, you can raise it at any time. And then we have the minutes of our last meeting. Any comments or errors or omissions on those minutes as have been distributed? If not, a motion to accept them would be in order. Thank you, Tracy. Motion to approve the minutes as presented. Seconder for that. Thank you, Kathy. Any further discussion on those minutes? All in favor? Thank you. Okay. And so my chair's comments on the work plan. Very simply, our work plan essentially has had those, initially it had 6 steps or phases, but they can be broken down as an education phase, which I think we're just sort of ending off with tonight's session. We have a development phase, which we will talk about a bit later, where we want to start developing a plan and elements of a plan and elements of how to evaluate and measure that plan. And then we have a consultation phase. First, a consultation with council, get council's input into our draft plan, and then make some adjustments, and then consultation with the public. And so as we move along, I think we're still on track to deliver as to the original timeframe. And today's phase is sort of like a wind down of phase one and the beginning of us starting to develop what we might call an economic development plan or strategy. So that's all I want to say about that. And I review that not only for the members present, but also for anyone who happens to view this at a later time. So if we could move on to, I think we should have a motion just to acknowledge the fact that that is our work plan and that we're moving forward on that. And the words and the video memorialize that. So a motion to approve that overview, please. Thank you, Barbara. Barb, sorry. And seconded by. Thank you, Tracy. And any further discussion? All in favor? This is with just the four of us voting here. This can move along quickly. So, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint or whether you're going to do creative dance or something.
No, you don't want to see me dance.
Okay.
How about the PowerPoint? So I can bring it up, or and then I just got to figure out how to share.
Amanda, could you make him a co-host, please?
Does that work?
He has the ability to share his screen.
Okay.
It's not popping up yet, Steve.
It's not. It says share. I'm hitting share.
And then you have to pick the screen in which you want to share.
I see. Well,
And then you have to hit share.
yes, I've done that. Well, what's that doing? Is that working?
Nothing as of yet.
Nothing yet.
Nothing. Really? Okay. Show taskbar. Display settings.
I can share it if you would prefer, and you just can tell me to go through the slides.
Sure, except this should be right. Like my slide is showing. Why isn't that sharing? How about now?
Nope.
Nothing. Okay. If you want to do that, that would be fine.
Over to you, Amanda.
I wonder why that doesn't work. Okay, great. So thank you, everyone. I would just say that so these are some series of slides that some have were made before for other uses, and some of them were made for this presentation. It was a collaborative effort with Michael, Brian Plumstead, who is our tourism specialist and who gets into Environics profiling quite a bit, and Brad Noble, who is our data specialist. So I'll go through some of these slides. There's nothing, in many of them, it's just basic data. There's nothing earth-shattering in some of these, although I think there is some insights, and I'll try and point those out. There is other data that we can dive into. And for example, we didn't do a deep dive into, say, the manufacturing sector or industry sectors, which might be useful to do after, but you can decide that. So next slide. So this just gives you a basic snapshot. And Michelle, if you want to put this on your website or at some point, but as of 2020, here's our municipal profile of Great Highlands, the demographics, population, the education levels, your average income, your marital status, and occupations by population by occupation. So you got a lot of trades, a lot of sales, management, which is pretty normal. I would have thought healthcare would have been a little higher, but that's what it is. So next slide.
Steve, a quick question
Steve.
before you go on. Sorry. Source for all of this information, is it all from Environics?
No, this will all be Stats Canada. Yeah.
Okay, Stephen, and that presents a problem for health particularly because the Grey Gables, everyone that's employed there is indicated as an employee of the county, so it shows own sound. The hospital shows that they work for Grey Booth Health Services. So it shows Owen Sound as their place of employment for StatScan reasons. Okay, because that's what
yeah.
I know that because McSweeney made the same argument, and it was, and I dove into it at that point. So the
Stats Canada asking the individuals where they work versus, so they might live elsewhere.
Well, they don't ask them. What they do is they access the employment information and occupation from the employer's submitted reports. And so Owen Sound says we have all these people employed for us. Owen Sound Hospital says all these people work for Grey Bruce Health Services. Long-term care, all these people work for long-term care for the organization.
Sure that's how are you sure, Jim,
yes.
that's how Stats Canada collects the census data off the census?
No, not census data, but it's produced by StatScan. StatScan collects data 1,000 different ways.
Right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Sorry. You're right. This will be census data.
Yes. Okay.
Census data.
It's just that it's because of the corporate structure of the hospital and long-term care, particularly, I believe the health numbers are underestimated.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Brad and clarify.
Okay.
That's what this is. And in the 2021 data, like the last census was 2016, and then the next one was, so I will clarify that because it does have an impact, but census data knows where you live and knows where you work. And that's where they get into the commuter data, which is good data. But I know you're saying some of the consultants they'll over and underestimate based on like EMS data. You got to be careful about that.
Yeah, but also don't forget, census data only get occupation information from those who fill out the long form.
Yeah, well,
they don't get it from the short form samples.
Right.
And so it's, anyways, I'll stop there.
They would argue it's representative, but I know what you mean. I know what you're saying. Okay.
I'd be pleased to.
So again, we just have it's basic information. I think, when you think about how your community is made up in terms of single family homes is the dominant structure. And you can see where our age structure is. This is one of the things I like to point out to people. Everyone says, well, why do we have such a problem with our labor pool? And it's because when you look at the age of 55 to 64 and then 65 to 74, this is where the peak boomers are, and they're all leaving the workforce. And the age group that's replacing them is, in some cases, almost half. So we have a low unemployment rate and a challenge with our labor pool because everyone's retiring now. And yet they're not withdrawing their services. They still want to go to hockey games and go out to restaurants and demand a coffee. And so they need labor services, but they've withdrawn their own labor. And so that's where the crunch is coming from. It's also why we have to attract newcomers in Canada in general to replace that workforce. But this has been building for a while. And then it gets compounded when you have a community, say like Blue Mountains, where they have a high population growth when retirees are moving in. Well, they still need services, but they're not bringing any labor with them. Mm-hmm. Also speaks to the type of housing they will need. Generally, at some point, as you age, you need to move out of a single detached home and into either a rental unit or some type of living eventually. And then you see the construction on the right-hand side. This is pretty common across all of Ontario. A lot of building happening in the 60s and then declining. And although I would start to see this moving up, I would have thought we'd start to see this moving up and across gray, but I guess we will the next census. So so the other point on this is just to look at the number. There's a lot of people who are single and who are still living, evidently, because there's not a lot of rental units in single detached homes. So it's just something to think about going forward when you think about zoning and what type of housing you want. And when you talk to developers, we probably need to be thinking about housing types for individuals. And of course, a lot of people drive commuting by car. That's pretty evident. So next slide. So household income, households with children at home. I mean, your Grey Highlands is the dark blue, or however you want to call that. So it's pretty consistent across the board. It's interesting that the community that the largest number of children at home is Southgate. And I suppose that's maybe two factors. They've got a lot of new people moving in, but could also be Mennonite population. Next slide. So a household by age of maintainer, I guess that's, and you look at this, this is again, you're not too far out of where everyone else is, although I would look at, you're a little higher proportionately for people who are 75 and older. So you have a lot of your older group is the maintainer. So next slide. So age of children at home, again, you're in the middle of the road, but it's hard to tell unless you really look at these slides, but you tend to be a little higher, ever so slightly in the 0 to 4 and under 5 to 9, but also 20-year-olds and 24-year-olds. That age group, you're also got a lot of people with older adults at home. Again, maybe that's a function of not a lot of rental units, or maybe they're just mom and dad are good to them. I don't know. So next slide. So household size, again, there doesn't seem to be a lot of differences across Grey, and Grey Highlands is down in the far left. Again, I just point out the 23% of household size are one person. And so when you look at the housing type, it kind of, there's a bit of a mismatch. You've got a lot of singles who are in their own homes. It's not a bad thing, but at some point we may want to think about where we're going to transition away from that as they age. Next slide. So not a lot of rental units. That goes right across the board. Except for like Owen Sound, it has a lot of rental units, but this is an area you might want to think about, or I think is an economic development strategy. How do we encourage more rental units? People who are just starting out and people who are retiring or downsizing tend to rent. And so if you have a pretty low mix here, but that's again, not uncommon as you look at the other percentages across the county. Next slide. So again, this just shows you the type of unit. I don't know what other dwelling type would be, row housing, I guess. Next slide. So this is an average income, and maybe you guys knew this, but you have the second highest income in Grey County after Blue Mountains, which is pretty significant, I think. I don't know what that means, but it's interesting to know. And maybe, when I say averages, it could be that there's some really wild swings there. We may have a lot of people at a very high income, and then a number of people at the lower end, and then the average comes out where it is. So it might be something we want to look at further. I don't want anyone to look at this and say, oh, everybody in Grey Highlands makes enough money, and so that's not what it's saying. But next slide. So your education levels are, I think, certainly equivalent to what others have. Got a lot of high school, a lot of college, few apprenticeships, and a fair number with university degrees. So I think over time we see that the population is getting more and more educated. So I don't know that there's anything here, or red flags here, that I would point to. Next slide. And labor force participation at about 61%, right around where everyone else is. And of course, this number is going to get lower and lower for everybody as the labor pool dries up. And as a strategy, it's going to be really important to attract newcomers to your community to replace workers, but also just to be workers. So, you know, if you attract people and they're all retirees, that's not necessarily going to help your labor pool. So as the participation rate, as we age, that becomes a challenge. So I think you have to be thinking about how you make your community appealing to keep young people, attract young people back, but also newcomers who may not have a connection to the area. Next slide. So this is by occupation, and you have a pretty interesting mix. You got some manufacturing going on, which is right up there with some of the communities, well above others. That's the very far left or right slide. Sales and service, that's not uncommon to see that there. And then transportation and trades. I'm not really sure. I don't know if you have any insight why you would have so many in the trades and transportation. I guess trades would reflect maybe the manufacturing side. I don't know.
There are a lot of independent trades in the area, and
Right.
there's a couple of big trucking companies
Okay.
in the area.
Would that be because you have contractors servicing the big boom in Blue Mountain and Collingwood, and they commute over?
There's enough building activity going on locally that lots of trades keep
Right.
busy,
Right.
not too far from home. Yep.
Right. Okay. Next slide. So this is this next few charts come out of the group management study that Grey County's just completed, and the update because I think Randy and I were both looking at numbers in 2018, and we were kind of, this doesn't make sense. The interim Stats Canada projections were well past our projections that we had just finished. And so they had to go back out and have Hempson relook at the population numbers. But what they also did as part of that study is look at your supply of available land. And this is something that's really important. And I know, Michael, your planner will be looking at this and will have a handle on this. But when you look at primary versus secondary available lands, there's not an awful lot of primary service land left in the municipality. Now, some of it will be allocated through a site plan and won't have been developed yet. And so as that gets built out, that's still adding homes to your supply. But this is something you want to look at to make sure that you're ahead of the game and have enough of land that's been identified, because it's not easy to bring on new lands to develop and then to service them. So next slide.
Steve, is that acres or hectares?
Hectares. Yeah. It was
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so when you look at the population forecast for the county, and you look at the various census, you know, we honestly went negative in between 2006 and 2011. And I actually think that's when Bruce Power was starting to close down, if you remember that. And then the last census, you know, we barely moved at 0.3, but the growth since 2016 to 2017, 18, 19, the average is 1.4. That's a significant, it doesn't seem like a big number, 1.4% growth. It is when your previous growth was like negative 0.1 and 0.3. So really seen an increase right across the board in all our communities. And of course, Blue Mountain being the number one. I think that's the next slide. But I guess what I'm showing here is that there's an explanation of what was happening, and it's pre-pandemic. It started in 2016. We started to see the shift, boomers moving to the area. And then the pandemic just kind of complemented with your ability to work from home, and people were moving up here. And we won't actually see that until probably the next census, what that impact was. But it's projected to keep going. Like you can see, the growth rates are still fairly significant. And again, these are just, they're their best guess today, because it could change and be higher than that. So next slide. So this is the forecasted updated population growth. And again, they don't seem like they're high numbers relative to where you're going. They could be higher. In other words, if your developers come in and build houses and are successful in selling them and people relocate, your population could easily be higher than this. So again, we're seeing growth that we have not seen in gray for a while. So we're used to having lots of time to think about these things, but that's the other thing with development. It never really goes, there's no sweet spot. It's either roaring or it's kind of stagnant. It's sort of the way of the world. Next slide. So allocation of seasonal units. You'll notice that the municipality of Grey Highlands is second only to Blue Mountains. And it sort of has them declining in both cases. And I'm not really sure why that is. I need to ask Scott what that's about, but it's still a significant number. And whether that's these units being sold and converted, but I'm not sure. But there's an awful lot of seasonal estimates here. And I don't know, maybe Michelle knows, are they bringing on a lot more seasonal units, but everything that's coming online is full permanent residence, is it not?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, and we're seeing actually everything that's on the books, as far as we know, is coming on for permanent residents and permanent dwellings. But we are seeing a fair, especially since COVID, the conversion of seasonal units to full-time homes for residents. So I think that might have some impact. Right.
I wonder if that's what they're projecting here. But it's a significant influx honestly, Blue Mountain is that influx comes almost year round. You get summer and winter. Would that be happening the same as in Grey Highlands? You get a lot of tourism? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we have a different audience, right? So you've got the seasonal people who hate winter and winter down south, and then come here to enjoy the outdoors in the nice weather. And then on the other cottages like Eugenia, et cetera. And then on the other hand, we have the ski people. So we've got an influx of people who use this area as their seasonal base in the winter because of the skiing.
Right. Okay. Okay. Next slide. So this is just some of the comments from Henson, thinking that we'll return to pre-pandemic levels of growth in the short term. Rapid rise in housing constructions, it predates the pandemic, mostly driven by boomers relocating. And then that's similar to what's been seen around the GTA and these other communities. And again, there's the comment about seasonal residents versus permanent, and who knows what the future will be, people working from home. So we may see more conversions happening. It was interesting to note that the other comment they've made, not on this slide, was that the boomers are hitting their retirement age at the same time as the millennials are hitting age 30, which tends to be, if they can afford it, their primary housing years. So you have this other group, the millennials, buying houses at the same time as the boomers are moving out into these areas. So it's a bit of a combination of things. And they also suspect that tourism will return once the pandemic is over, although that seems to be who knows what the end date of that'll be. So next slide. So these next few slides are what Brian Plumstead has worked out through Environics. And so what he was able to do is take mobile cell phone data for these communities. So these are not municipalities, these are these communities, these downtown centers. And he defined or filtered out residents versus a visitor. And he defined a visitor as someone who's traveling more than 40 kilometers. And so the data was tracking who is a visitor and who's a resident in these communities. So if you show us the next slide. Oh, isn't that great? It's not showing, is it? Oh, it just needs to load. It's slow. So using 2019 as a baseline, so pre-pandemic, you'll notice that the number of, obviously the total number of visitors versus locals, the highest in Collingwood and then Owen Sound. But Flesherton, as a percentage of visitors, is attracting a significant number of visitors. And so when you take the daily visits, that's not individuals, that's person visits, if you will. So when you look at Flesherton, there's 2.8 million visits, and of that, 68% were visitors. So you've got an awful lot of visitors going to Flesherton and Markdale. I didn't know that. I mean, does that make sense to you and those that live there, that there's a lot of tourists? And just to be clear, Brian said that this wouldn't be somebody just driving up the highway. They have to stop in the community to get caught, to get picked up.
Okay, but does that mean getting stopped at the red light?
No, I just was talking to him, but he said they gotta be basically there and get out of their car. They have to stop for a fair amount of time before they get picked up. If they're just going, it's not just picking up people driving through in the highway. So I find that interesting.
I'd like a bit of, I don't want to challenge that, but I'd like a little bit more clarity, because those numbers do seem awfully high for stopping traffic, stopping and engaging traffic. Like Jim, if it's cell data that's being captured, and maybe Michael can provide us some insight when he comes to our next meeting, because the numbers don't ring true with me based on, I mean, it does if you sit there at a stoplight and look at the traffic going through, but I don't know if they're stopping and engaging, which, provides a great opportunity if they're not. And how do we do that? But
I will guarantee you that there are not 5,256 visitors every day of the year in Flesherton. That's 1,918,000 divided by 365. Comes up to 5,256. There's no way that's that many visitors that could stop, get out of their car and engage in Flesherton on a daily basis. No way. And I'm in there every day.
So you're showing up as the local. Where's your cell phone, Jim? Maybe you're showing up as a visitor. Maybe it's you.
Maybe that's possible. My wife would agree with you.
You're going to stop going to the coffee shop. You're pushing the numbers up. So no, those are very good questions. I mean, that's why we do this. We want to show you. I mean, I asked Brian about this, and he understands the Environics stuff really well. And I can have him dig into that, and both him and Michael come back and explain this. Because if it doesn't ring true, then there's either an explanation that's not missing, or there's a mistake somewhere. because it's gotta make sense. So to me, I was like, that seems very high.
Yeah.
Okay, and the next slide, so I'll get him to check that. And then next slide shows 2020, which shows that there's the decrease. And so the impact of the pandemic. But of course, the proportions are still there, but and obviously showing the seasonality of it down below. So I'll have I'll ask Brian to prepare. Well, you know what? Why don't we just have Brian back on with Michael to explain that? And frankly, I don't know what Michael was going to bring. He was going to look at some data himself. So.
And Steve, if I may, even the impact of the pandemic, I've seen other numbers that actually showed our traffic through Flesherton increasing during the pandemic, because while people were, in lockdown, all you had to do is go to Hogs Falls. So
right.
I'm a little bit.
Well, according to Brian, like Hogs Falls isn't in Flesherton, but and I have to find out how he defined.
Yeah, and I know they're not, but most people going there would go through Flesherton. So if they were captured as a traffic count using cell data through that point, anyway, I think it's really interesting data. I think it gives us a lot of opportunity to look at how we're capitalizing on this opportunity, both from an ECDev point of view, from a tourism point of view, but also how from an infrastructure point of view, what this means for us.
Yeah, and where do you want to position Flesherton versus Markdale? And
exactly.
And Markdale may be more the service center, and not that it couldn't serve both, but Flesherton, being on, is it half services? Flesherton's not on full services, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, there may be, not that there may be just some limitations there, but certainly an opportunity if that's the case. And what exactly are we looking at? I challenge them. It's not traffic counts. That's not what they are, or passing through. So those are good points. So next slide. So this is what he was talking about, change in daily in the comparison. So there was a decline, and there was a significant decline in the visitors, except for Hanover, which he couldn't explain that to me. Next slide. So this data is employment and employed and self-employed, and this data comes from the eAnalyst OMAFRA data, which is a combination of modeling that they do from census data, from labor market surveys, payroll data. And so at the Grey County level, it's pretty accurate. At the municipal level, they modeled this. So these would be approximate numbers of where your industry breakdown is. And so it shows a 10-year span from 2009 to 2019. So of course, your manufacturing sector is your biggest and has increased. That's not surprising. And of course, Chapman's and Ice River Springs would probably make up the bulk of that. And then agriculture being a very big group, of course. And when farmers fall under the self-employed, because obviously, and then your other sectors being retail. Interesting that retail dropped, but I think that's fairly consistent across the region. And then healthcare being your next biggest sector. And that makes sense because you have a hospital. And then of course, accommodations and food. It's pretty common that our finance and insurance is pretty low. Wholesale trade is kind of low. Utilities is kind of low in our region. And constructions is not too bad either. So this doesn't surprise me. If you go to the next slide.
Could I just ask a question?
Sure.
About the previous slide. I'm just wondering, in the manufacturing sector, Is that including small scale
Yep.
industry? Yes, it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And just a little, manufacturing is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, it used to be a large plant was 1,800 people. Well, now they talk a large plant being, 200 people. And those 200 people put out almost more output than, 10 years ago, 1,000 people put out. And it's just an ongoing trend and I think part of that is just efficiency, but it's also robotics and the fact that they can't find enough bodies. So, we could probably in this data figure out from e-analysts, and this is where I was saying earlier at the beginning, we might want to dive into this a little more so we have a little bit of better understanding of what each of these sectors is, but what's the breakdown in the manufacturing sector? Are those numbers dominated by the couple large players, which is probably the case, but what about the other players? Like how many other manufacturers do you have? And we can kind of get some numbers on that. This slide talks about your competitive strengths, a location quotient. And I don't know, Jim, if you want to explain what a location quotient is, but it compares the percentage of employees you have in a sector relative to the province. And if you have a higher percentage, you then are considered a specialization in that particular sector. So it's really not surprising to see that you have a specialization in the number one. So that second column, anything over one is sort of a specialization. So you have a specialization in agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, and manufacturing. And then as you go down the list, administrative support for waste management, that's close, it's 1.23. And then other services, 1.18. And then you can see on the other column relative to Grey County. But this, you had an increase between 2009 and 2019. You saw insurance and finance and real estate really grow. You saw manufacturing really go and agriculture grow. And you saw a bit of a decline in transportation, retail, and wholesale trade. I always find that finance tends to kind of go with real estate. So it doesn't surprise me that these numbers don't surprise me necessarily, although construction seems to be down. I'm not sure what that's about. Doesn't mean it's not important. It's just from the change.
Yeah.
So we could go into a little deeper dive into this data. It would be, you could look at how many businesses are in each sector. And the NAICS code is pretty high, like it's a 2 level. So there's a lot that goes in there. That would capture everything in manufacturing and everything in retail.
I think if there is deeper dive, I think it's fairly clear that manufacturing and agriculture are important. And what the actual metric is secondary almost. I do think, though, that healthcare is one that's on the cusp, and I think we need to understand better the data that are there and what's happening to it. Because I do think a strategy of focusing on our strengths is one that still has potential to pay great dividends.
I agree. And, 16% increase in employment in that sector.
Yep.
So we could dive into that. And you'd think that, if tourism is a big, significant element there, you could position your downtowns to service that and kind of reverse that trend there of 22%. And again, it's a very large, 2009 was just after that second last recession. So it may be better to take more of a 5-year lens and look at 20 2020, even though it's a pandemic. I could probably go in and look at that data from that.
Yeah.
What's happened over the last 5 years as opposed to the last since 2009. And look and dive into some of that. And so the other one I think we could do is just look at the self-employed and see how big that is. It won't tell you what sectors they're in, it just tells you the size of it.
It's huge in this office.
Yes.
Barb's got a question.
Hi, I'm just in looking at this. I think it's always very interesting to look back, but as we look forward and with our existing kind of age demographic and kind of some of the other areas there, I think the area of healthcare in particular, where we have been versus where we're going to end up going, is going to be kind of two very different kind of spaces. So I think as part of that deep dive, it might be interesting to think, you know, we're looking at over, I guess, a 10-year continuum. What do we think the next 10 years is going to look like, and how we would potentially need to adjust as we understand a little bit more detail into each of some of these different areas.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, just because this is what happened in the past doesn't mean, you know, where do you want to position the community? And the demographics, I keep talking about it because it's so there, and yet people just seem to forget about it. Our population is aging, and it's going to age rapidly. And at some point, you know, because I'm part of the boomers, I'm at the back end of the boomers, we're not going to be here. And I guess that'll be someone else's problem. But, you know, as they move through the healthcare and there's more demands on healthcare and the type of housing and changes needed, it's going to impact all that. And again, your ability as a community to attract new residents, a new workforce. And we all know that, you know, part of the challenge, and Chatsman has been very open, and now a lot of people are open, they need more housing and more rental units for the type of workers they need, introductory workers. So the data points gives you a snapshot, but then you figure out the strategies going forward. So I'll dive into this a little bit more, and I will check and maybe have Brian explain exactly what that data is and what other data he has to support that on the tourism side, and particularly in Flesh and Markdale. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
And we'll clarify what the census is and where they're grabbing it.
Yeah.
There is, and I don't know if this is of interest to you, but there is data on commuter patterns. So where are people moving and going to? So it's, you know, I don't know if you're interested in knowing how many people are living in your community and working outside the community, and how many people are working inside your community but living elsewhere.
I think it's about 5,298 that go down the highway every morning. With their cell phones.
He's not going to be convinced that there's anyway. Yes. Okay. And I don't know, is there one more slide? I don't know that there is. Oh, yes. So this slide is, and there is more behind this slide, and maybe I could have Brian talk more about this, but this is the amount of revenue generated by Airbnbs. And, you know, you're second only to Blue Mountains. Blue Mountains, the blue, of course. But Grey Highlands has a significant amount of revenue that's coming in through Airbnbs. Does that make sense?
If you say Grey Highland property owners have a great amount of revenue coming in, because they're the ones who are collecting it, the municipality only gets a modest fee.
No, right. But so there is, what I'm saying is there's, you know, I don't know who they are. Sometimes they're a bit invisible, but does that make sense that you got a significant number of Airbnbs operating in Grey Highlands, and you know, these people are coming in, and of course the landowner gets most of the money, and sometimes they eat out, but I mean,
So I can speak to that, Steve. I've spent 2 years of my time dealing with this issue related to Airbnb. It is a huge, or short-term accommodation. It's not just Airbnb. That's the generic Kleenex of it. It is a huge impact. As Jim said, this does not hit the municipal coffers. Yes, we've introduced a licensing program, which probably costs us more than any cost recovery licensing thing that we're trying to track. But what I think this data does show us is that it starts to show some evidence of tourism activity and the potential economic impact of this sector. What we know is that most of our tourism activity in the region is not necessarily tied to direct ticketed, gated ticket sales, to specific attractions. It's a lot of activity related to our outdoor spaces. So we've got people using our assets, but not necessarily contributing, or us not having an understanding of what that activity level is. And I think this as an indicator gives an opportunity and starts to allow us to look at how we convert some of that activity into economic impact for our businesses and our community broadly. So it's a great indicator, and getting this data is huge in my mind.
And I think a 4% accommodation tax like Toronto yields on their hotel stays would be not a bad idea.
So just on that note, we had intended just prior to COVID to go forward with a destination marketing fee recommendation for Grey Highlands that would include all roofed accommodations, including short-term accommodation. And then COVID hit, and we looked at what with the huge impact COVID had on a lot of our traditional roofed accommodations across the province. We thought it probably wasn't a good time to do that, but I think this probably needs to be revisited, especially when you're seeing some of this data come forward.
Right. I mean, Airbnbs, what it shows is you have, visitors or tourists coming into your community. They are spending money to the landlord. And where else are they spending money? And maybe you want to direct them to your downtowns. I mean, that is what our fall marketing campaign for Grey County, and it's just being launched today. You're going to see that, and you're going to see stories written about that. They're going to be talking about, the trails, the fall colors, but then get to our downtowns to spend your money. And I think you just have to, if that's a strategy, do you want to have friendly Airbnb policies and encourage them to establish and having a good licensing, but then also organize them and make sure that the guests know where they can go to spend money. I mean, that is a bit of a strategy that Bruce County employed, because they were finding the same thing. Everyone was going to the beaches, they were going to their cottages, but they weren't necessarily finding the small communities and the retail shops. So it could be a very insightful strategy going forward. And I would also say, whenever you're dealing with an economic development strategy, you want a diversified economy. And we are, you do have that. You have agriculture, which is, and I should say that, point out as well that agriculture, manufacturing, and tourists are wealth generators. They bring wealth to your community. And then the secondary impacts on retail spending and construction and things feeds off that. So creating wealth, having wealth generating sectors is very important. Tourism being one, manufacturing is another, agriculture. Some say healthcare, depending if you're a larger regional center. But I believe that's the last slide.
Well, I think the discussion and the comments that have been made by the people who received your information, Steve, sort of indicate how valuable it has been for us. I think it's very useful. I think it's something that, like a good cup of tea, has to steep for a while. We have to think about it and reflect on exactly how those various pieces fit together into a strategy. And of course, that's part of where we're heading. So thank you to you for presenting it and your role in getting it together, and for Michael and for Brian, and I forget the last.
Brad Noble.
Brad,
Yeah.
for putting it together, because not only was the information interesting, the graphic presentations were engaging as well. They were easy to understand. I do think we need to, as we move forward on a parallel course, still explore some of those issues that are not as clear as we may like them to be, around health, around tourism. There's no doubt that the importance that agriculture plays. There's little doubt the importance that manufacturing plays in Grey Highlands. But as far as the tourism, to get a better handle on it, in terms of visitors and what have you, using whatever method, and also to dive down a little bit more into health. One of the reasons it grew so dramatically from 2009 forward is that the Community Health Center was established in 2010. Right. And right now employs about 50, 60 people. And so it's including full-time and part-time. And so it's that would have just been a new addition, as it were, to the total numbers. So yes, thank you. Now I want to make sure that if there are any questions hanging right now from any members on the committee, that we have an opportunity to direct them to Steve. Are there any questions, Tracy?
And it's not really a question, but just a couple of comments. It's a great presentation. I find it interesting, the numbers in Flesherton. So I happen to live on Lake Eugenia, but my address is Flesherton. So to me, those numbers actually did make a bit of sense, because there's 400 properties, let's say, on the lake, and I'm not sure if all the addresses are Flesherton or not, but we're not Eugenia, we're Flesherton. So if that's included in those numbers, then at first glance it did kind of make sense to me. And with those numbers, is it tracking every phone basically that is with a non-local number? Because it's potentially, you have cars full of 4, 5, 6 people, all with phones. Yeah. So my sense is that they're tracking all of those. So with those two data points, the numbers kind of make sense to me, but of course, deep dives are always great. And the second comment was on those numbers, labor, I think it was Grey Highlands versus Grey County. Is it possible that some of those Grey Highland numbers, there could be a variance because they've moved from another region within Grey County? So you could have had someone that was working in Owen Sound that now works in Grey Highlands and vice versa. So we have 8 different regions. So that could cause some of the variances in those numbers as well. So those were just two points.
Right, I'll go look at that, but I'm pretty sure eAnalyst, the data is, where you're living, where's the job? It's not like stat. And you can figure that out through the commuting. So you can actually get the number of people who are living in your community but working elsewhere, or how many people whose job is in your community but they live elsewhere. So I'll clarify that for sure and see if I can do a little deeper dive.
Thank you.
Tracy, your point around the address around Flesherton is very valid. I mean, my address is Flesherton as well, even though I'm 5 kilometers away. And so that's why I think we need to have a little bit more data. If it does include the postal area of NOC 1EO, then you're right. The numbers do get a lot closer to being representative of what could be going on. So I think if we do that little bit of further information, originally my reaction was that it was talking about only the village,
So-
and 5,000 different cars.
Well, and that's the way I said it. I did say it was because that's what I asked him about, but
Yeah.
so that could explain what's going on. So.
Yeah.
So Steve,
okay,
if I
great.
can jump in there just a little bit, my understanding from Brian about those numbers, because we had some other data, we've dealt with this before, that there is a corridor that they establish. So it's not the broad geography. They kind of create a geographic corridor, which in my understanding was actually the village of Flesherton, the village of Markdale, not the broader geography. I can stand to be corrected, but I think that was always my understanding, because I was trying at one point to get that ancillary data and said, oh, just put your geofence broader, and they can't do that. The other thing that I wanted to point out in those numbers, I made some notes. I have some particular, I think we need to challenge the growth projection numbers. I noticed we talked about population in 2021 being estimated to be 11,210, and in 2046, 12,780, which is only an addition of 1,570. We have 300 homes in the Devonlea development, Center Point South. So let's say, you just do that times, let's say an average of 2 or 3 people per house. We just had 96 acres sold in Markdale to Loon Call Developments for a significant housing development. I think they are very low projections. I would argue that perhaps by 2023, we might be up to that 12,780, unless we all, we drop off directly and there's no new growth and we're all going to die by 2046, which may be the case. I think those are really underestimated.
I think you could get in line for Randy's office for those comments, because I think there's a lot of people who are thinking the same. But it's going to all depend on how fast those developments get taken up and what's the absorption rate. And they could very well go crazy. So I kind of looked at those myself and kind of think at the current rate, it seems a bit kind of low. But
Any other questions? Councillor Little. Kathy, please.
Thanks, Jim. I don't know how relevant this is. Just when we're talking about employment numbers, I'm curious about the impact of volunteerism on local economy. And I know volunteers provide generate a lot of revenue for communities just in unpaid work. And with our demographic being, sort of slanted towards the older age groups who tend to have the time to volunteer to do things. Is volunteerism, when you're looking at, broad economic development strategy, is that a factor? Thank you.
Well, I certainly it's volunteerism is a big part of a community and community building. I don't know that we have a great metrics for it. It's certainly not picked up in economic data and employment data and that kind of thing. But when you think about the contribution and the social enterprises, that part of your community is very, very important. But I don't necessarily know how to measure that. Maybe there's something on the census data that I'm not aware of. So I could ask Brad, is there some measure there? But I'm not aware of it. Yeah,
thanks. I was just curious because I was reading, I think, across Canada, and I don't remember numbers, but the economic value of the work that volunteers do and, and the services that they provide are huge. And I sort of wonder how that fits in with, paid work and the other factors that we've been looking at. So,
well, it's it's certainly an impact when you think about demographics and you've got this large group of people that are now leaving the workforce who are also, at one point, a lot of them volunteered a lot. And as they age, they're going to get to the point where they won't be volunteering. And I think you're starting to see some of that with some service groups and clubs not able to function. But I always, when you go to the regional hospital here, in Sound, and you're helped by all these volunteers, you think, if they weren't here and you had to pay staff, that would be quite a labor force they have in there. But the same thing happens everywhere in, early childhood education or people looking after kids, or a family member or grandparents. That's happening all over. So, the other part is I don't know whether these numbers pick up what's happening in your Mennonite community, which is another sector which I think is a huge competitive advantage for our region. But getting data on that is very difficult.
Yep. Yep. The CHC I referred to, I just was in a meeting earlier today, and they right now have 58 regular volunteers. So that's more than they have staff members, and so it's all around. Any other questions for Steve at this point? Could I get a motion to receive the broad demographic overview? Thank you, Barb. And Kathy, thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor? Thank you. Again, Steve, thanks a lot.
Yep,
it's almost like we're working together again.
Yeah. Well, it's every community is a little different, but I think you guys, when you think about what the potential of where Talisman is and then what you're doing in your downtown, I think it's exciting. And then you're doing this strategy and you look at the data. I think you got, there's things you can guide the community to and get the right policies and then get aggressive and knock on doors and talk to investors. I think that's a really interesting, it actually is working.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Steve. Now I'm going to, what I was going to outline is a general review and approach to what we've done, and I'm hesitating, and the reason I'm hesitating to doing that right now is we have a couple of members who are not here. There's some additional information I'd like to learn from some of Steve's data he just presented, and I'd rather write something officially and distribute it to everyone. But I will give an overview of what I'm thinking very briefly. I see us preparing a document, a strategy that very briefly touches on a lot of the information that we've covered during our education phase. That we talk about different approaches to economic development, and we focus on the fact that we're talking about quality of life, and we're talking about a strategy that touches on a lot of different lifestyles and population groups. I think we have to start in this document, start talking about how we see ourselves going forward. And one of those ways may be to first acknowledge what some of our challenges are. And I think Steve has articulated, or at least stimulated our thought around the challenge of matching our demographic profile with the needs of a vibrant, growing economic society. And how do we attract other people? What does the implications of that potential mismatch have on labor, on housing, and other aspects? And I then think that we have to come out with some sort of economic development vision statement that builds upon the current strategy and documents of the municipality, but specifically comes up with a vision that we see moving forward. And as implicit in a lot of Steve's comments and a lot of our questions and discussion, that to me leads to this notion that as an economic development strategy, we should identify those sectors that we can build on, how we can build on our strengths. And we've heard about downtowns. You know, Steve keeps referring to directing traffic to downtown. We've also heard the municipality working on its revitalization of downtown. So the major settlement areas could be a focus area for a strategy. Agriculture. A lot of agriculture is going through a dramatic transition right now, particularly in Grey Highlands, with the Mennonite population, the C4s, and the centralization of most of the cash cropping. And so that is something that I think would have an impact. I am personally convinced that health and wellness should be part of that strategy as a separate segment. And that would not just mean the hospitals and the doctors and the CHC, but also I think it talks about a vibrant relationship with the environment, hiking and active lifestyle. And then thirdly, this whole question of tourism and the 2 million people looking for coffee in Flesherton, and understanding that plus the advantages of STAs, short-term accommodation, other almost both passive and active tourism. People who are here for a day and just going for a hike or lining up at Hogs Falls, or people who are more actively involved with skiing and longer stays. And if we can as a group agree upon, and there might be others, core areas to invest in and develop, and to develop for the benefit of Grey Highlands' future, we could then, under each one of those, figure out what are some of the things that we could encourage to be undertaken. What do we do to promote health and wellness in Grey Highlands? You know, do we, right now, the municipality gives some cash to some organizations, whether it's capital or operating, but what else could be done? Or is there anything else? What about agriculture? How can we support agriculture? Maybe the Grey County Federation of Agriculture would be like to be located more centrally instead of in Owen Sound. And maybe they'd want to be located somewhere, you know, near Center Grey. Oh, that would be in Grey Highlands. So, you know, there's things that we may want to think about how we can support agriculture. And some of it might be with tax policy or other types of tools. And same thing with downtown. I mean, downtown right now, we want people to go down and patronize commercial enterprises in downtown who are paying commercial taxes for their retail operations, yet the municipality still allows retail operations to operate like a home occupation, paying no additional taxes, yet the traffic's generated and it's retail in the countryside, which is competing against the downtown cores. I'm not saying that has to be a strategy, but it's something we should talk about. So help to develop some strategic positions, in other words, some suggestions that we could put to council in our first workshop. And so that's how I'm sort of picking up from the discussion. And also, I think our approved work plan is sort of leading in that direction. And what I will undertake to do is to, before our next meeting in October 19th, is have a document that tries to capture the general approach that I just outlined as a very preliminary draft, with some suggestions that we can talk about. And I will endeavor to get that out at least a week or so in advance, so people have an opportunity to read it and think about it, and be able to provide comments at our next meeting. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? I'm seeing heads nodding, which means yes. Okay, I'll get pen to paper on that, and we'll do that at shortly. Yes, Barb.
Just one thing that just popped into my head in Steve's review. We started to talk a little bit about the Mennonite community, and what I'm wondering is if there is any diversity data or anything that we should be looking at in the context of that community versus other communities as we look at opportunities and how that fits into the demographic.
Steve, do you have a?
I think the Mennonite community is a massive opportunity, from the perspective of you have a supply chain here that has a built-in labor force and is cost effective, and labor force is the thing that companies are going after. So you have a consistent supply chain that does good work, that is using equipment that is incredible. And I don't know if you've toured any of the Mennonite farms and communities, it would blow you away. And I actually think you could have an economic development strategy, Southgate and yourself, where you might want to think about creating an industrial park where you actually, with the Mennonite community, go out and talk to some of their customers and bring their customers up who do the assembly and value add. Because right now they produce a lot of, production stuff, but it's very low cost. The competitors that I talk to, they will not even, if they know the Mennonites are bidding on something, they won't even bother putting a bid in. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know of any other way to get data on the Mennonite community other than to go and knock on doors. I know there was some work done in Southgate, and they have some broad indications of how many are in woodworking and how many are in metal. I did tour a manufacturer through the Mennonite communities to a couple of shops, and this gentleman out of Toronto was very, his jaw was on the ground. He could not believe the equipment that was in these shops. Now, the challenge for him was he was wanting very precise non-production. So he wanted 10 parts and the tolerances had to be really, really fine. Mennonite community isn't quite there yet, but they could be. So I don't know, again, maybe Michelle, do you know where we could get more data on the Mennonite community?
Not through a formal, we have, and I'm not going to say not through a formal process because not all of that is, but through conversations, and I've had some significant conversations, and I'm actually due to hook up with a community representative later this month. I have to follow up with them. But early on, like a year ago, we were chatting about them. And, at that point, we knew there were probably over 150 of these, what we call it from our zoning perspective in Grey Highlands, C4 shops. At that point, we were estimating, or in my conversations, they were estimating that 60% of those shops were metal shops, with the balance being in woodworking, a few plastics, a greenhouse, a harness shop, but mostly in metals, woodworking, and plastics. The opportunity for supply chain extension is big. How generally what we've observed and through conversations is that most of their production is not done from A to Z in one shop. They do elements of a process. So step one would be done at one shop, and then it moves to a next shop who does it part B and then part C till a product is finished. The quality, and I have toured a few of the shops, is world-class on some of these things. They are looking to expand their opportunities here. We do know that through our digital Main Street program and building out our digital or our business directory over the last year, we've started to formally capture that. And I think the opportunity to work with that community is high. I think we need to be respectful, and we can't go in and bulldoze, but I think they are good community partners. And I think perhaps what we've been doing from a municipal perspective is looking at the Mennonite manufacturing sector simply from a land use perspective, and maybe haven't been pushing forward the opportunities from an economic perspective. One of the things that we do know is that in Grey Highlands, the size of shops that can be accommodated through our C4 zoning is much smaller than in Southgate, which is, so if we want to work with this community, we need to look at things like this, and it is more than just land use. So the opportunity is there. You're probably not going to find data in the same traditional ways, but I think there's a real opportunity through conversations and partnerships to build out the opportunities there.
Yeah, I think because that is a little bit of
Michelle.
I was just going to say, because that is a little bit of a point of difference to some of the other communities. And I wasn't sure how that might fit into the mix. So it might be a strategy as well that we want to consider.
Very good.
I would
Good
highly
point.
encourage that. Like, I think it is critical. I think we would be remiss if we didn't. Oh, the other thing I should point out is a year ago, they were averaging that each shop employs approximately 3 off-farm employees, as well as the owner and his farm help. So that, if you just look at that and you start to look at 150, if you're looking at sectors, 150 shops a year ago times 3 off-farm employees, that's significant when you look at the employment numbers for Grey Highlands.
Yeah. Steve, did you have a comment?
Just to, and one of the challenges we have is that the planning and land use limits the size of those plants. So if you want to attract, rather than take all their product and put it on a truck and send it out of the community, and you want to retain it to do value added, we need to determine an industrial park where we can get bigger players in assembly. And it's not necessarily attracting the Mennonites to that industrial park. It would be their customers. So an end user like Skyjack down in Guelph, put a plant up here and use that supply chain. I would suggest to the chair, Jim, that you may want to organize a tour because I've gone on 2 tours and I'm always impressed with both the attitude of the owner, but also what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay. Good suggestion. Thank you, Steve. There is an industrial park that's already been established in Southgate, just south of Dundalk.
In Southgate, yeah.
Yeah.
They're almost out of land.
Yeah. They're out of land.
Yeah, they're selling it so fast. It's
At their industrial park?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't seen any buildings yet, though.
Well, that's what I always, where's the rest of
Yeah, exactly. Okay, can we have a motion to sort of understand and agree? Thank you, Kathy, that we're going to produce a document for next review. Thank you. Is that what you were doing, or did you have a question? Okay, thank you. And Tracy, did I see your hand seconding? Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor? Thank you. Item 5.4, I was going to request the mayor to set up a special council meeting for a workshop for a half day. Councillor Little, could I ask your point of view on that? Because the mayor can call a special meeting whenever he wants. Would that be a proper approach?
That's correct. I did have a question for you about that. Is when were you, I was looking at your timeline. Were you thinking, in November. Was that
Yes.
sticking with our
Yes.
timeline?
Yes.
Yes. Usually what happens, if he wants to call a special meeting, then staff sends out a doodle poll to make sure everybody's available on a certain date. So I'm sure between the mayor and staff could accommodate.
Okay. So should the four of us pass a motion today that we request the mayor to set up a meeting in November for a half-day workshop? Amanda's your hand up. You've got your blur feature on. I can't tell. Sorry.
Yes, it was. Sorry about that. I just wanted to request that if we attach the minutes to the next council meeting agenda and we put this request on as well, that it can be decided at that point how best to hold it, whether they add it onto a committee of the whole, whether they add it onto a closed session meeting, as opposed to just the mayor calling it. So I thought it might be better to put it in the hands of all of council, but that's completely up to this group's discretion.
And it's up to the mayor.
It depends on how you word the motion.
He has the authority to call a meeting whenever he wants, a special meeting.
Yes.
Yes. So what I would suggest is that we entertain a motion that says something to the effect that the committee request that Mayor McQueen arrange for a half-day workshop meeting with council to receive a report from the Economic Development Advisory Group. And how that happens, the process is left in the hands of the mayor and the other municipal processes. Does that sound like now I can't move that because I'm in the chair. But if that sounds reasonable, I would entertain a motion to that effect. Thank you, Tracy. And a seconder, Barb.
Jim, just before you go on, can I ask a question about that? And I lost my feed, so I had to dial back in quickly to this. You said that you were going to request Mayor McQueen to call a special meeting to receive a report from this committee. Is that what we want?
No, we want to. No, we don't. We want to schedule a workshop.
Exactly.
To review our report and get council's input.
Yeah, that was my thought. I think we'd like it, I thought, be a little more interactive.
Yeah. I probably would have caught that in the draft, the review of the draft agenda. Okay, is that okay with the mover and seconder that we use that more active language? Okay, thank you. Any further discussion on that meeting in November? Does it say in November in that motion? I forget it, Amanda. If it doesn't say in November in there as well somewhere, please. Kathy?
I just would like to hear the motion before we vote.
Sure.
I was
Amanda?
actually just going to suggest that I read it out. So that the Economic Development Advisory Group requests that Mayor McQueen schedule a half-day meeting in November with the Economic Development Advisory Group to conduct a workshop.
Schedule a workshop meeting to review a report from the Economic Development Advisory Group and receive input from council. So one more time.
Sorry, I was just making sure my wording was correct.
Oh, that's fine.
That the Economic Development Advisory Group requests that Mayor McQueen schedule a half-day workshop in November with the Economic Development Advisory Group to conduct a workshop to review a report from EDAG and receive input from council.
There's two workshops in there. Get rid of the second phrase with the second workshop. Okay.
Mhm.
Are we okay with that, with the with that version? Okay, all in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda, for that. Michelle, any additional comments you'd like to make in the next 30 seconds?
I'll be brief. If related to our conversation earlier, I did want to advise that we have requested funding for an outdoor adventure tourism strategy. We put that application through in April. We're partnering with Grey County RTO7 and have requested some provincial funds to expand the scope of that work into more than just a strategy, but an action plan. I'm hoping to hear back very soon about this. We're pushing the province to give us an answer, but obviously whatever is done there will impact some of the discussions that we're having around this table. So I think that's important to note. As you know, to update the group, we have, our portfolio is economic and community development. I think as we discussed several months ago that, the community side of it is the other side of the coin around economic development. We have a number of things going on there. We have just engaged consultants to undertake a recreation master plan, which, not only will look at our facilities and outdoor spaces related to municipal or to resident use, but we'll also be taking into account projections for growth. So the numbers we talked here are going to be critically important. For this group, as you know, I updated you that we've updated our community improvement plan and the application process. The first intake for the 2022 applications closed on September 15th. We will be reviewing those, and then those will be coming before this committee for some input as well. So just to put that on your radar. I think that's it. Well, obviously the downtown Markdale visioning, I'm working on that RFEI. I'm very far behind on it, and I apologize, and I hope to have that finished this week for the steering committee review so we can start to solicit some input related to that. The Beaver Valley Visioning Corridor report was presented to council last week and approved by council as a guiding principle. So that went forward. If you haven't, just totally irrelevant, but we are, the municipality is hosting a rodeo this coming weekend to support the new Markdale Hospital, which is great, which I'm really excited about, and the community has stepped up big time. And the community grant program that we work with all our community groups for, the closing intake for that program is September 30th. So all of those deadlines are so that we can go forward through the budget process to have discussions and make sure that the requirements that are coming through and what we're seeing from the community and our business community can be brought forward for council during budget deliberations. I think those are it. Key
Thanks,
things.
Michelle. Any questions for Michelle on that information? I think we should have a motion to receive that information for information. And is there someone who's prepared to move that we receive that? Thank you, Tracy, and seconded by Barb. Thank you. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you very much. Is there any comments that any members of the committee would like to make at this point before we move on to talk about our next meeting? Any comments? I see none.
Jim, can I just ask that Steve, I'm sure he will, but if he can send that his presentation through so we can attach it to the minutes and have that publicly, because it was a great presentation.
I think you already have it.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Okay, so no comments under number 6. Number 7, our next meeting would be on October 19th, which I believe we're back to our regular nights on Tuesday, same time. It'll be virtual. And it says November scheduled meeting date overlaps with council. Okay, and the suggestion is that we be moved back to Monday, on that day, which would be November 15th instead of November 16th. Are both of those dates agreeable with everyone, that we meet on October 19th and November 15th? Okay.
November 15th, I hopefully will be in the Dominican Republic. So I
Okay,
won't be able to make that one.
We'll go to you.
Yeah, we'll all come down. Meet on the beach.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, we will do that. And then I think that the next thing we will do is we'll adjourn. I know I didn't do a motion for the change of dates. I don't think it's necessary personally. So the dates we've changed the dates as recommended.
I would like a motion, if you don't mind, Chair, because we passed a motion at the beginning of the commencement of this committee to meet on the Tuesdays. So if we're changing it, I kind of have to have something to go back on.
I'll agree with that, but I'd like to see it in the procedural bylaw next time. Okay, anyone have a motion to change for those 2 dates? Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Tracy. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Is there any other comments from anyone? Okay, thank you all for showing up, and I look forward to our next meeting. And Amanda, thank you very much for all your help and support as usual, particularly since you had to be the slide master through the presentation. So once again, well done, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Enjoy your evening.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.